Chapter 22. Sheetrock dissolved at its touch. So did biological remains such as rat dung, roach leavings, and dust. Each particle contributed to its growing mass, the matter transforming into another individual synapse and adding to its essence. It dragged its growing body down the hall, searching for a way out. Its dreaded enemy, UV light, was completely absent from this level of the building, but it didn't know that. It only knew that it was dark and inviting. But it was running out of food. It had sensed food behind the security door, but the metal kept it from the prize. It had to find more. It would find more. Wandering the maze of hallways, it finally found one that led to a wider space. The creature, realizing it needed speed more than bulk, stopped in the hallway. The bulbous rear end crackled and sizzled as it retracted. The thing's squat middle elongated slightly and shimmied. It commanded the outer particles to transform, and they changed from liquid into a translucent shell. More crackling. 3 more legs slowly coalesced beneath it and lifted. The creature, now on 6 multi-jointed legs, skittered down the hall to the open area. It was fast now, faster than it had ever been. It knew there was more food. It only had to find it and become. Chapter 23. The breakers in the adjunct had tripped, meaning they had no lights in the ER annex basement. And since no one was answering the goddamned phone, Terry Mixon could only assume the security guards didn't have any communications apart from their radios. And down here, the reception was shit. He normally got at least 1 bar on his cell phone, but now there was nothing. Great fucking night. Mixon cinched up his pants and walked down the well-lit concrete hallway. This was the part of the hospital most of the doctors, nurses, and even the janitorial staff never saw. Getting down here was via security access only, and that included the morgue. It was the only way to make sure bodies didn't disappear and people didn't get hurt. The boiler room, the electrical closets, and the tool areas were places where a normal person could get into big trouble. And since the terror scare, the folks in charge had made sure they didn't leave themselves open to an attack. Well, that and the congressional mandates making it so. Not many people believed some asshole wanting to meet their deity in person was going to bomb or sabotage a hospital, but it wasn't worth taking a chance. Hence the security and the fact the basements were swept every hour and the computers knew every person that came down here. Mixon continued walking, his tool belt jingling with his heavy steps. His radio crackled, belched static, and then a tiny falsetto voice broke through it. "There?" Sighing, Mixon pulled the radio from his belt. He clicked the button. "What do you want, Macumber?" "Mixon, you in the basement?" "Aren't I always?" he replied. Macumber was the facility's honcho. Nice guy, but he sucked at his job. "What you need?" Macumber cleared his throat. "Why can't we contact security? Any ideas?" Mixon stopped and held the radio in front of him so he could glare at it. He imagined the tiny plastic grooves were garrots slicing through the man's jolly cheeks. "I'm heading over to the adjunct now, going to check out the phone and electrical junctions." "Right. I'm already on my way down. Meet you near the divider. Out." The radio burped more white noise and then went silent. "Meet me?" Mixon asked the empty hallway. "Wow, you're either bored or just had your ass chewed." He placed the radio back on his belt and continued walking. Strolling through the basement was like entering a tunnel you weren't sure had an end. It wasn't dark per se, but gloomy nonetheless. The fact that it housed the morgue was fitting and ironic as hell. The docs that ran the place were damned demented. Whenever they caught him wandering the basement, they told him a new joke or a bizarre anecdote about an autopsy. One night during a vicious storm, the power had failed in the morgue. No place else, just the morgue. Mixon had been awakened from a half-sleep by the shrill sound of the phone. When he saw who was calling, he knew it was trouble. Goddamned Dr. Roche. Mixon had left his tiny office, grabbed his tool belt, and headed across the basement to the morgue. Upon arrival, he'd swiped his key card and headed into darkness split only by the glare of a flickering and buzzing no-exit sign and the emergency lights. Roche, still wearing his smock and apron from an in-progress autopsy, had greeted him outside room 2. The doctor, with his trademark handlebar mustache smiling above his lips, wore his usual shit-eating grin. Without his surgical mask, Mixon had thought the man looked like a walrus merged with a ferret, and the walrus got the better end of the deal. "I need power if I'm going to finish dealing with this mess," the doctor said in a scratchy, high-pitched voice. Nails on a chalkboard didn't begin to describe the sound, but the man's smile was infectious, even with that ridiculous caterpillar beneath his nostrils. Mixon had blinked at him before heading to the electrical box. The doctor, stinking of offal, had followed him around as he checked the fuses and made sure nothing had been tripped. Turned out several of the breakers had tripped. One at a time, Mixon had turned them back on and checked the power levels. He thought he was done, but then Dr. Roche was waiting for him at the door to room 2 again. "Still ain't got nothing in here. No lights, man." The large electrician followed the man to the doorway and then stopped. He'd suddenly realized he was going into a room where a stiff was lying down on a steel table being poked and prodded by this sicko, and the man had called it a mess. Shuddering with revulsion, Mixon had forced himself to walk into the cool room. It had been a scorching summer day, and Mixon was happy for the cool air, until, it had simply enhanced his already puckered goose flesh. 3 emergency lights, boxes with 2 lamps, had lit the room. As if Mixon had needed more proof that the morgue was the pit of hell, he'd noticed the backups barely illuminated the room at all. The cold metal shelves where the stiffs were kept gleamed dully with the weak light. The stainless steel autopsy table was almost completely in shadow. Mixon had been thankful for that. He'd walked to the wall adjacent to the shelves, all the while feeling the clammy touch of angry ghosts on his back. Mixon had opened the electrical box, his flashlight cutting through the gloom, and seen the problem at once. As with the other few boxes, breakers had been tripped. Mixon had run his checks on the voltage, made sure he wasn't about to get electrocuted, and then flipped the breaker. Incredibly bright white light punished his retinas. He'd squeezed his eyes against the glare and turned to face the middle of the room. That was when he nearly pissed himself. Roche stood next to the autopsy table. A corpse, at least part of one, had been sectioned on the stainless steel. The demented doctor hadn't even bothered covering the damned body with a sheet. Mixon had a clear view of the split-open chest, the caved-in head, and exposed organs. The right femur had been fractured and parts of bone speared through the bruised flesh. The man's head had been caved in on one side, fragments of skull visible through the punctured and squashed skin. The remaining eye had dangled down from the socket on red veins like a yo-yo. The doctor had giggled at the expression on Mixon's face. "This, Mr. Mixon, is Thomas Reed." He'd reached down and lifted the corpse's one intact arm. He'd waved his hand at Mixon. "Thomas says hello." Mixon had belched. It had been all he could do not to spew his gorge on the floor. He'd tried to look away, but his eyes had found the late Mr. Reed's crotch. The hip bone had broken and jutted out near the man's crotch like a second, bloody candy cane penis. "What? Why the fuck would you show me that?" Mixon had yelled. The doctor had only grinned wider. "So you could see what a motorcycle wreck can do to the human body." "I don't ride a goddamn motorcycle." Roche had winked. "And after seeing this, you never will." Mixon had vowed then and there never to visit the morgue again under any circumstances. With any luck, the power and communication problems hadn't spread there. It was the night shift, and that meant somewhere in the morgue, Roche was carving up a late hospital patient or someone the EMTs had scraped off the pavement. He shivered as he walked, but not from the cold. The memory of the dead man's face still haunted him, and he guessed it always would. "Please don't make me go in there again," he whispered to the empty hallway. Mixon finally reached the entrance to the morgue. Lights bathed the sign and shined down on the security card reader. He sighed with relief and continued walking. 10 meters ahead of him, the security door opened with a loud squeak. Macumber, dressed in khakis that barely fit around his ample belly, and an oversized pressed blue long-sleeved shirt accompanied by dark sweat stains, walked into the hallway. The door shut behind him with a loud bang. Macomber flinched and turned to regard the door with distrust. "Hey, Macomber," Mixon called. His boss flinched again and then turned in a fast circle. The man's patented lopsided grin appeared on his face. He ran a hand through his dark, thinning hair. "Mixon, how you doing?" Mixon shrugged. "I'm here, ain't I?" "Yeah," Macomber said. Mixon waited for his boss to say something else, but the man just stood there on shifting feet. He looked nervous. "Something going on?" Mixon asked. Macomber nodded, the grin fading from his face. "CDC quarantined the ER and the trauma center." "Quarantined?" The pit of Mixon's stomach tightened. "Another Ebola scare?" "Don't know," his boss said. "I didn't get any information from the triage station. Just heard about it from one of the nurses they evacuated from the area." "Wait, they evacuated everyone?" "Yeah," Macomber said. "Everyone but the surgeons working in the ORs and the attending. Not sure what else is going on or how many CDC folks are up there. I just know the phones are out to security. Well, that and the ER." "Shit," Mixon said. "So I gotta go up there too?" "Probably. Shall we?" "Yeah," Mixon said and hitched up his pants. Damn tool belt was so heavy it defied any and all attempts to keep his plumber's crack from showing even when he walked. His wife had threatened to dress him in overalls, something Mixon considered anathema. He walked past his boss, feet aimed squarely at the darkness ahead. The trauma center adjunct had been built when the original trauma center and ER became the most profitable part of the hospital, and that meant the new construction didn't exactly mesh up with the original building. Lots of wires had to be carried across, network cables run through the concrete walls, and the foundations matched up. They'd done a good job, but there were still parts of the adjunct that made it obvious it was built as an afterthought. For one thing, the adjunct was lower than the main building. The basement hall joining the two had a slight incline, although the construction team managed to make that invisible on the ground floor. Here in the basement, they hadn't even bothered to try. But at least the two buildings were connected. Mixon hated the thought of having to go outside to get around to the junction boxes and maintain the lines. This was a much better way to do it, even if it meant he had to occasionally suffer the morgue doctors like Roche. Macomber walked next to him on stubby, short legs, taking 1.5 steps for each of Mixon's. The man's breathing was an annoying snuffle that made him sound like he was partially suffocating. Mixon liked his boss in small doses, but tonight he had absolutely no patience for bullshit. They neared the junction between the two buildings. Beyond the single emergency light casting a dim spot of brightness in the center of the hallway, the building's basement was pitch black. Mixon reached and pulled the powerful flashlight from his belt. It had 10 separate LED lamps inside and was the brightest light Mixon had ever owned. Tonight, he'd need it. "Coming to watch me work, eh?" he asked his boss without turning. Macomber snuffled again and then took a deep breath. "I just want to make sure I get a chance to talk to security. Plus, if you need help, there's no one else coming." Mixon groaned. "Justman call in sick again?" Justman was the other night maintenance man. Unfortunately, the guy hardly ever showed up, was always late when he did, and seemed sick half the time. Mixon was pretty sure the guy had a drinking problem, but he hadn't bothered getting to know the other man. In Mixon's world, you showed up and worked. You didn't skive off and make excuses. Work when work was to be done. Lollygag when there wasn't. "Weather," Macomber said. "He's flooded in." "Sure he is," Mixon said. They walked beneath the last security light. Mixon pulled the flashlight from his belt and pressed the recessed button. It clicked softly, and a tight beam of bluish-white light slashed the darkness. "After you, boss," Mixon said. Macomber turned his head and stared. I think you should go first. You know this place better than I do." Mixon grunted. "Fucking coward." Shaking his head, Mixon stepped forward into the darkness. Macomber a meter behind. The wall seemed to close in with each step. He didn't want the boss to sniff it out, but the basement was starting to freak him out too. Mixon had never seen it this dark in the building. He wanted to stop walking and rethink this. Come back with more lights, maybe. There had to be a better way than just heading into the... "What's that smell?" Macomber asked. Mixon stopped, his every nerve shaking with electricity. Macomber was right. There was a scent that didn't belong. His nostrils had been trying to tell him that for several moments, but his fear had distracted him. "Maybe whatever took out the lights broke a sewer line." The words had come out in a hesitant, shuddering stream. Mixon bit his lip. "Calm the hell down," he told himself. Mixon took a deep breath and coughed. The smell was so strong it practically singed his nostrils. "Doesn't smell like shit," Macomber said. His voice was so tremulous that Mixon turned to him. Lines of worry crisscrossed Macomber's pale face. Mixon was about to agree when he realized what it did smell like. He swallowed hard and tried to speak, his voice managing little more than a croaking sound. He cleared his throat and tried again. "We might have a homeless guy down here, boss, cooking rats or some damned thing." "No," Macomber said. "Something got fried by a short circuit, don't you think?" "Sure," Mixon lied. "That's more plausible." He moved the flashlight in a slow circle. At first he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The concrete apron running between the two buildings was white and clean as... Wait. Clean? The janitorial staff hardly ever came down here to clean, let alone polish the goddamned floor. But it shined back at him as if someone had spent hours mopping and polishing it. No, he thought. You can't shine concrete. He took a step backward. Macomber narrowed his eyes. "Something wrong?" "I'm not going down there," Mixon whispered. "Sure we are," Macomber said with false bravado. "We have to get the electricity back. For security." Security, Mixon thought. If there was ever a time he wanted an armed guard in this gloomy dungeon, now was it. But Macomber was right. They had to get the phones back up, not to mention find out what the hell happened to the lights. If there was an emergency and they needed the guards, how would they contact them? "Okay," Mixon said, and walked 3 steps before a shadow jittered in the beam of his flashlight. He stopped suddenly, and Macomber walked into the back of him. Mixon didn't scream in fright, but it was a near thing. "Did you see that?" "See what?" He felt like screaming. "If you weren't hiding behind me, you'd know." Macomber giggled. "Sorry." Mixon wanted to yell at him, but he couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the spooky shadow dancing in the beam of light that moved like a worm wriggling on a hook. "See that shadow?" He felt Macomber move beside him, the man's breathing more snuffily than ever. "That's fucked up. I mean," Macomber said haltingly, "what's casting that shadow?" That's when Mixon's balls turned to ice. He wasn't looking at a shadow. That thing was real. It was moving. And then it started moving toward them. His stunned brain processed the information a little faster than Macomber's, and that's all that saved him. He took 3 steps backward, tripped over his own feet, and fell to the concrete floor. His tailbone shrieked in pain, but Mixon barely noticed. He was too focused on the tentacle lashing out from the darkness and spearing Macomber through the chest. Blood and bones sprayed out the man's lower back. Moisture peppered Mixon's face as Macomber's body went rigid. A creaking sound erupted from Macomber's open mouth as the hooked appendage jutting from his back flattened, and then the large man flew into the darkness. The stench that had underlain everything was now palpable enough to sting Mixon's eyes. A deep frying crackle filled the junction and echoed off the concrete walls. Mixon's frozen claw of a hand held the flashlight, the beam stabbing forward, but showing only the floor directly ahead of him. He shuffled backward, the light in his hands jittering wildly. Something moved in the darkness with a clicking sound. Mixon's brain screamed at him to move, to get the hell up and flee. His body finally listened. As if in a dream, time slowed to a crawl. He pushed up with his arms and managed to get his feet under him. His knuckles bled from scraping the concrete, but he hardly noticed. He stood in a half-crouch, the flashlight still gripped in his hand, the beam pointed into the darkness. He wasn't sticking around to watch. He turned to run. He made it 4 meters from the gloom before he stumbled. The stumble turned into an awkward, painful roll across the concrete. When he came to a stop, a volcanic eruption of pain soared up his right leg. Mixon rolled onto his back and reached for the wounded extremity. His hands passed through where flesh and denim should have been and touched wet concrete. Still screaming, he sat up and looked down. His leg ended at the calf. The scream stopped with a choke of horror as his brain finally managed to process what he was seeing. A meter away, the severed length of flesh, foot still in the shoe, lay in a slick ribbon of dull crimson. Blood poured from the stump, looking strangely bright beneath the dull glow of the security lamps. Still cradling the remains of his leg, a billion thoughts went through his mind. He knew he should remove his belt and wrap it around his thigh as a tourniquet. He wondered if the trauma team could reattach the severed portion of his leg. He didn't want to be a cripple, goddammit. He couldn't do his job on crutches or a wheelchair or whatever the fuck. He'd never be able to play darts with a prosthetic leg. He'd never... A sound finally dragged his mind back to reality, and he slowly looked up into the gloom. A leg appeared, and then another, and another. The darkness seemed to fold into a shape that was even darker. A long tentacle that ended in a bloody hook flipped through the air and then across the concrete. It speared his missing limb and dragged it backward. The pain was suddenly forgotten, as were all the mundane thoughts of mortality. There was nothing left but the gibbering madness of fear as the shape coalesced into the light. The tentacle holding his leg flipped backward and deposited the meaty flesh into a maw of black. Click, clickety, click. The creature moved forward, and the scream that had been locked in his throat erupted through his mouth, vocal cords tearing from the strain. It quickly devolved into a guttural drone. Eye stalks waved from the squat thing's rounded body, the bulbs atop each of them peering at him with alien malevolence. 5 tentacles fluttered through the air, making a whistling sound. But it was the mouth. The goddamned mouth was filled with jagged obsidian teeth, the inside glistening like the blackest oil imaginable. When Mixon's attempt at a scream finally gave out, he couldn't draw breath. The creature was a mere meter away when it bent toward him. The stench of rotted, fried meat mixed with the coppery tang of fresh blood emanated from the tooth-filled hole in reality. Mixon stared in horrified wonder, his mouth open in a silent scream. The creature sizzled and crackled and then lunged at his other leg. His foot disappeared into its mouth. A tentacle lashed out and punctured his shoulder. He scrambled to keep it from dragging him inside its mouth, but he couldn't get purchase. He tried to scream again as the thing dissolved his legs and torso. Finally, his glassy-eyed, dead face disappeared into the maw. A moment later, his keys, cell phone, and the metal fasteners from his jeans dropped through the creature's bottom and fell to the concrete floor with a cheery jingle.